Does Shakespeare write like a girl? This is not what led me to Mary Sidney in the first place. So many people think, because it's an easy argument to disprove, oh, Shakespeare didn't write like a girl, Shakespeare wrote like a man. Oh, now we're done with the argument. So when I went into looking at Mary Sidney, I did not go in as if, because the plays are written like a girl. I didn't go in that way. My first clue was, the sonnets are mostly written to a man. That's not a huge leap to think that maybe a woman wrote love poems to a man. So that was my entry into it. But I'm going to talk about 15 minutes about Mary Sidney, actually, because I'm really more interested in what do the plays show us about the women. So, does Shakespeare write like a girl? 15 minutes on Mary Sidney. You will have to listen fast because I'm telling you 2 hours of information in 15 minutes. And then we'll look at the women and some of the interesting things. So, Mary Sidney Herbert, Countess of Pembroke. When I ran across her short story, I was happy to find three things. One, she wasn't dead. Now, because I know there are great arguments about the dating of the plays and the publication of them later, but if I'm going to enter this argument without a penis, I don't also want to be dead. So I couldn't take them both. So that made me happy. She was born 3 years before Shakespeare. She lived 5 years longer. The other thing that made me think, wow, this is someone possible, because I was looking for a froward woman. I thought if a woman wrote these plays, she wouldn't have been a wallflower. We would have known stuff about this woman. Even though she's a woman, we still would have known things. So when I discovered that she developed the most important literary salon in English history, I thought, now that's a girl. That's a girl I maybe should look at. This is her home in Wilton. And the third thing, she had a mission to create great works in the English language. Now, all of these things I'm talking about I'm not making them up. These are well-established, documented information by a broad range of Sidney scholars. I try not to make up anything in here because I have always tried to stay away from surely, must have, certainly, because it's so easy to make everybody's life attached to the plays. Is it Shallow in one of the Henry IVs who says something about Robin, John, and Scarlet. Robin, Scarlet, and John talk about Robin Hood. I'm Robin, my sweetheart of 25 years is John, and my youngest child is Scarlet. Robin, John, and Scarlet. It doesn't mean I wrote the plays. So I try to stay away from that stuff. So everything I'm telling you is documented facts. This is something Gary Waller said about her, 1979. Wilton and the spirit embodied and furthered were central to late Elizabethan high culture. And there were few major poets who were not in some way connected with it. Guess who's one of the few? So also an important thing for me is that she comes from a family of writers, for one thing. Something that's always bothered me about William Shakespeare is the fact that he sprung full-blown from the head of Zeus. No previous background on the education, on learning the rhetorical devices, the literary things that this person knew. So I was pleased to discover that her mother and father were known for their verses. Her brother, Philip Sidney, of course, very famous. Her younger brother, Robert Sidney, wrote the largest collection of manuscript verse, lyric verse, of the entire era, which was not discovered till 1965. Her son, William Herbert, published a book of poetry, and Herbert, her daughter, is known to have written. And also that this wasn't a vacuum. As we've seen today, there were numerous women who were writing, who were philosophers, who were politicians, who were tavern owners and print shop owners. So this isn't a time period when women were, as we've come to believe, we've been led to believe all of our lives that, oh, women were merely chattel. I'm about to smack the next person who says, women were merely chattel. That there was a lot going on in this world. Witherspoon says that there was probably never an age in which women held greater sway, physically and intellectually than during this period. So Mary Sidney, what some people seem to think about when I talk about Mary Sidney, they think, oh, well, she's so anomalous from everybody else in the whole era. That's not possible. But she wasn't that anomalous. There were the Cook sisters and Lumley and Amelia and Bess of Hardwicke and vast range. So she's one of the women who was a little more empowered during that time than others. So looking at her work that she did, because again, springing full blown from the head of Zeus just doesn't make sense. So she did the Psalms of David. Her brother started them and he died, and she edited his. And 164 poems within that series, she used 163 different verse forms. This is somebody who is studying the craft of writing. Triumph of Death, translated from Petrarch's Italian original. And she's the only writer for a couple hundred years who used the terza rima form that he used. She translated, because translations were okay for women. They were a defective form, and you were translating a man. So they were okay. Discourse of Life and Death, translated from the French. So we know she speaks the languages fluently that we know the author read. Other literary works, even her personal letters, were used in a book of models of epistolary prose. She is the first woman to publish a play in the English language. It's a translation, not like Miss Carey's version a decade later of Miriam. First woman to publish a play in the English language. It's the first play in blank verse, the form that Shakespeare used. And she actually took this to press. She'd been taking her brother's works to press for several years now. First woman to publish original pastoral poetry. She got away with this as a woman because she did it for Queen Elizabeth. She's the first woman who did not apologize for being a woman. If you look at the dedications of every other woman's work at the time, every one of them says, I'm still a good mother. Oh, I'm still a good wife. Oh, I'm doing this for God. God asked me to do it. She doesn't do that. So what Margaret Hannay, her most prominent biographer, said, Mary Sidney herself, by remaining within the established limits, became the most important writer and patron of the Elizabethan period, one who demonstrated what could and what could not be accomplished in the margins. As a woman, even in this fairly enlightened time, she had to work within the margins. So once I had that body of establishing her as someone competent and forward to do this, I went looking at other connections to her, like the more than 200 books that we know this author had to have read. And we've never found a book of Shakespeare's. I wondered, did Mary Sidney have any of these books? And I was astounded by the number of books that were written by her brother Philip, connections to Robert Sidney's work, connected to the writers in her circle, things that she asked them to write. She asked Samuel Daniel to write a sequel to her Antony, etc. Lots more about that, but we don't have time. The sonnets. So the sonnets, the traditional story of the sonnets is that the poet is in love with a younger man and believes the younger man is in love for a time with a dark-haired, dark-eyed, newly married woman, and the woman seems to be married to somebody named Will. And no one has ever found definitively documented any of these other characters that in Shakespeare's sonnets. But intriguingly, in Mary Sidney's life, and everything I'm telling you here is documented, we have a poet who is in love with a younger man after her husband died. She was 43, he was 33, Dr. Matthew Lister, and for a time she thought that her younger lover was in love with a dark-haired, dark-eyed, newly married woman, Mary Roth, Mary Sidney's niece. It turns out that Mary Roth is not having an affair with a younger lover. She is having an affair with Will Herbert, Mary Sidney's son, her first cousin. After Mary Roth's husband died, she had 2 children with William Herbert, which wasn't discovered until 1935. The first folio poem by Ben Jonson has that weird thing in it. this weird little bit where he talks about Celia's ignorance. When you're reading this eulogy I'm telling you here, if you're going to not really get it, because something else is going on, he's sort of telling us. And he says, this is that blown up. Or crafty malice might pretend this praise and think to ruin where it seemed to raise. These are as some infamous bawd, a pimp, or a whore might praise a matron. What could hurt her more? I have never found anyone to be able to tell me why Ben Jonson is using a pimp and a whore and a matron to introduce the first folio. In Mary Sidney's life, and again, this is documented, and I don't have time to go into the whole story, but we have documentation that her oldest son was a pimp for King James. The boy he procured, George Villiers, eventually became the Duke of Buckingham. Her younger son, Philip, was a whore to King James. That's how he got his earldom, was through intimacies with the king. So, and who is the first folio dedicated to? To her two sons. And also in that eulogy, Ben Jonson says sweet swan, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear, and make those flights upon the banks of Thames that so did take Eliza and our James. Do you call the Thames? Do you call James Gems?
But it's only an I rhyme, so it's Thames.
An I rhyme. We know nobody ever called Shakespeare a swan. Samuel Daniel, however, said that Avon shall be my Thames and she my song, and Michael Drayton comes right out and calls her Thames' fairest swan. In her final portrait, we have swan wings under her portrait here. We have swan quill pens, which lasted 500 times longer than regular quills. In her collar, this is every piece of this is swans, and her wrist ruff here is also swans. Someone talked about Philip Sidney being the swan. He was known as the swan. In French, cygne means swan, and there are portraits of him with a swan above his head. So this is a woman who wants to. Oh, two other things. Do you know what a female swan is called? A cob is the male. A pen, yes. And the famous thing about the white swan is they are mute until they die. In I think it's King John, he talks about the organ pipe of frailty, when that dying gasp is the only sound that they make. Also in this portrait, she's holding a book, her Psalms of Daniel. She's got pens, and she's got up here where you can't see it, the laurel wreath symbolizing a poet. And she's also got the Sidney Fay on here, and she goes by Mary Sidney. So this is a woman who, wanted to go down as a Sidney, not necessarily a Pembroke, and this is a woman who, in her final portrait, wants to go down as a writer. And guess where she's buried? On the Avon River. Right over here is Salisbury Cathedral, just 3 miles from her home. So that's Mary Sidney. That's why I personally think she is a very logical candidate for writing these works.